Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to continue my project of going back over old Booker Prize shortlists and look at 2000. I'm going back in 5-year increments from where we are now. And actually it turns out I'd already done all of the other ones up until then. So 2000 it is. And I'm getting incredibly close to the end of my Booker project, which is wild and lovely and surreal and all of those other feelings. But I wanted to look a little bit at the year 2000. And I was really tempted to almost wear double denim or something to mark the occasion, but realised I didn't have enough denim to make that work. So just imagine I am wearing Y2K fashion as we look at the turn of the millennium and these books that were part of that shortlist. So first up, we have the book that is both alphabetically first and is also the winner, and that is The Blind Assassin by Margaret Atwood. And this was an interesting win for the time for several reasons. It's Margaret Atwood's first win of 2 so far, and it has been sort of viewed both at the time and sort of since as being a sort of consolation victory, in the sense of it being given to Margaret Atwood for not one of her best novels, but because she'd been overlooked for better novels in the past. I disagree with this personally, although The Handmaid's Tale would have made an excellent winner. But this is a book that I still think is incredibly solid. It's also noticeable at the time there was a news segment immediately after the win was announced, where Alain de Botton, the sort of pop philosopher, cultural thinker person, went on to decry the book for basically being an insult, as if Margaret Atwood herself was ignoring the fact that she had readers and was dragging them through the book, through this drudgery of all of this information up front with no care for plot or anything like that. I think he's wrong. I think this is a very, very good book. And I will say, as a sort of addendum to that right from the beginning, I love Margaret Atwood. I've read a good number of her books. I think she's a truly incredible novelist and writer and thinker. Her poetry is good. I think her non-fiction is interesting. I find her novels fascinating and beautiful. And apart from her 2019 win with The Testaments, I think she is just, a really, really sublime author. And this book, I think, is a particularly interesting one when you dig into it, because in many ways it feels like a very typical Margaret Atwood book, in that she is always very much in control. And at some point you realise just what she's playing, what kinds of tricks she's playing with you. So the core idea of this is a woman reflecting on the life of on her own life and the life of her sister, who died younger. And her sister had been working on a novel, this sort of sci-fi novel, and there'd been lots of other things going on around the time for her as well. And so we are living a life through a lens of somebody who's outlived them and is almost too close to the subject matter. She can talk about things that her sister saw and experienced in her life, and she does occasionally seem to have a sense of bitterness, or there's an odd tone sometimes to what she's talking about. And this is what I think is one of the most brilliant parts of the book, because there's something about the way Margaret Atwood writes that really tense, longing, yearning sort of mood, as well as this sense of secret histories, or something going on that I think is so, so brilliant. And that for me is such a wonderful, typical Atwood, of just being able to really interrogate the inner life of somebody in this really fascinating way. And I think The Blind Assassin does that really beautifully. But it also ends up becoming this incredibly meta book. And I don't want to spoil anything about how the book moves towards its end. But this book is already playing along with meta qualities already, where we are not only seeing this story, but we're also seeing parts of The Blind Assassin, the book. So The Blind Assassin by Margaret Atwood is not the Blind Assassin that features in the book, which is a separate sort of sci-fi fantasy novel. And we see all of these little fragments of it. We see all these little parts. It's a book that plays around a lot with that kind of narrative style. And without, again, spoiling anything, the way the book then adds a level of meta quality to it, I think is really quite special. So this is one of those books where, although a couple of people maybe at the time grumbled, and although I think Margaret Atwood is more famous for many other books, especially The Handmaid's Tale, and I think personally could have won the prize several times over for novels like Surfacing, or some of her other work as well, I still think she is. I think this is a really valid winner. And once we look at the rest of the shortlist, we'll also see how there's an element of, in some ways, some crossover with a lot of other books on the list in terms of subject material, but also the ways that this book might have stood out really intelligently alongside those other books as well. So let's get talking about the rest of the shortlist. Next up, we have The Hiding Place by Trezza Azzopardi. And this is a novel that I thought was just really beautifully captured. It looks at a family, and particularly a Maltese family, living in Cardiff in the sort of mid-1900s, and sort of particularly post-war. And there is a large focus on the family dynamics and family secrets. So again, another crossover with something like The Blind Assassin. But what I think is really just beautiful is this is a book that doesn't necessarily have a central thesis in quite the same way. It's not a book that is necessarily about something in a really political sense, but it is a story that's really focused on this tight-knit family, and particularly the secrets that are hidden within that family. And that's what I found so utterly captivating about it, is that we learn right at the beginning of the book that there is something to do with a fire. And throughout the book, we start to learn more and more about what that fire entailed and how it happened and what that meant for everybody else involved. And so the book unfurls with these really interesting secrets and hidden parts about the family. But even then, beyond it, I just found the language of this really quite interesting, because it has this very colloquial, familial style, because, you know, we are just watching family members talk to each other, and the ways that family members often don't have to fill in the gaps, which is often, I think, a challenge for writers, is to, how do you convey that knowledge when obviously a family would never sit there and say, well, you remember in 1937 when you were 2 years old and blah, blah, blah. You know, nobody really talks like that, particularly in a family where so much is understood already. Families will say things like, oh, you know, her up the road with the thing. Yeah, did you see that thing about John? You know, that stories will go on like this, and this is how I think the book is very. The book is really good at capturing that element of it. And what we find throughout this story is that this is mostly told by the younger daughter, and the ways that she has to try to make sense of the world around her. She's trying to piece together a puzzle of her family and what she's been told, and she suddenly comes to realize that there's a lot that's probably been hidden from her in what's been going on in Cardiff at the time. You know, there's this small set of Maltese families around, and there is a sense that you keep those secrets within that community, or just in your house, because it's too fractious to really consider being a bit more open. And so this character, our central character, learns to keep hidden, and I think she's a really interesting central protagonist in this novel. Next up, we have Michael Collins with The Keepers of Truth. And this novel is interesting in many ways, but I think also there's a specific time capsule element of this novel that I found really fascinating, which is, although this is a book by an Irish author set in the US, but I think there's something really interesting about the timing here, because although the book is set in the 1970s, this is a book about the US, told from an Irish perspective, for the Booker, before the Booker had authors from the US. So it's very rare that you actually see the US appear much in Booker shortlists in any kind of way, because unless a book is specifically set there, most of the people writing will not be from the US, and therefore it doesn't really come up. But also, this is 2000, the year before 9/11. And so there's something also interesting about knowing that the novels that will follow from 2001, particularly sort of 2002, 2003 onwards, are also set in the shadow of that, even if the novel itself is from, you know, it's based in a different time period. So there's something also just interesting from the jump about this. But anyway, so this is a book that essentially is told through a journalist's lens. We are looking at someone who sees themselves as a keeper of truth, a journalist in this sense, and they are they learn about a murder that has taken place, and this is a murder that has shocked a small town, and therefore the journalists are operating in this very fractious and difficult time. They are trying to run around, find out more information, but at a time when most people are trying to shut it down. And kind of a bit like with the Hiding Place, this book also has quite a conversational tone, because it's told not only through these pieces of journalism, but also through so many of these conversations where they're trying to understand what's going on. And so this really is in many ways a murder mystery of sorts, but it's done in this really interesting literary style that feels more of a commentary on what does it mean to be a keeper of truth? What does it mean to tell a story? What does it mean to be the person telling the story, and therefore to be the one who is perceived as being right, or to exclude certain bits of information? And in many ways, this feels like a really recurrent theme for this shortlist specifically, is about secrets and stories and what we tell and don't tell. And that comes up a lot, obviously, in novels anyway, just by the sheer nature of what they are. But there's something specific about the ways that these turn up in these 6 books that I found really utterly fascinating. But yes, I really enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would. This is a book I'd never heard of prior to the booker, and just found really quite interesting. This sort of murder mystery through the eyes of a journalist, but in a style that feels like it's both a pastiche and a kind of modern day take on everything as well. Next up, we have Kazuo Ishiguro with When We Were Orphans. And this is a really noticeable thing from the 80s, 90s and 2000s with Booker shortlists, where authors like Ishiguro, Atwood, Ian McEwan show up a lot, Salman Rushdie as well, show up a lot in these shortlists. And these were really kind of the heyday for a lot of their writing, where some of their biggest books came from. And this I actually think is a really underrated gem from Ishiguro. It's one that I think is spoken about less when we speak about his set of novels. You know, Never Let Me Go, I think, is fantastic as well. The Remains of the Day, I think, is exceptional. But this I just found a really quiet, underrated gem. So the novel is about somebody, an Englishman in the 1930s, who is known for what he does in terms of his ability to solve sort of crimes or cases. And this in many ways also feels like it speaks to the Keepers of Truth, the last book I mentioned, in that it's another book about trying to unravel these little mysteries, and the same in some ways for The Blind Assassin. And what I think is so interesting here is we see him trying to look back at essentially a hugely a time where there was a lot of huge change going on. So both England, and a lot of this book is also in Shanghai, and those are, you know, 2 places within this book that come up a lot that would have radically changed in this mid and post-war time. So this sort of, you know, you've got Shanghai with this influx of sort of French culture and things at certain points. You've got various forms of imperialism happening all across both continents. And there's all of this kind of stuff happening. But what really I think is so powerful here is the emotional core of this story, where there are these moments where we're watching Christopher as a young boy trying to navigate this world. And he, at one point, becomes, he can't find his parents. And we watch for part of this book as he is essentially a young boy trying to fend for himself in Shanghai, a place that is incredibly foreign to him in some ways, but also not. And he spent some of his childhood there, but he's also spent his childhood in a very specific type of Shanghai. And now that Shanghai is moving and changing so rapidly around him, and he starts to feel that that's maybe not going to be a place of safety. And so there's something so interesting about this really beautiful story about this young man just trying to understand his parents, but where in a time where all of these historical records would have been incredibly complicated, and so many things are happening, and it's the sort of the roaring 30s or whatever almost. You know, there's this kind of boon period with the sort of 20s and 30s, and but then they're seeing a slide into war and fascism and various other things. So there's so much going on. But I think, yeah, the emotional core of this story, this young man trying to just understand who he is and where he's come from and where he fits in the world, and particularly a world that's rapidly changing, I think is just some of Ishiguro's best character work. I found it so utterly captivating and really beautiful. This next book was a real surprise to me, and again, one that I hadn't heard of before looking at these shortlists. And this is English Passengers by Matthew Kneale. And it's quite a long book, but one that does so much, I think, within what is going on. So essentially, bear with me with the description of this, because it sounds at first slightly bonkers, maybe not, but it sounds like a lot. It is a very ambitious project of a novel, and I think it pays off. So it's 20 voices of people on a ship traveling to Australia, and particularly Tasmania. And it starts from the perspective of they are traveling to try to look for the Garden of Eden in Tasmania. And so these 20 voices are narrating the journey, and some of those people are, you know, from various different walks of life, and they are commenting on different things as they venture into on their way to Tasmania. That's the kind of central premise. But a second voice running alongside those 20 voices, really, or second set of voices or whatever, is that being told by somebody who is an Aboriginal Tasmanian, talking about the impact of things like this voyage on native Aboriginal Tasmanians. And so what this book then starts to do is set up this interesting parallel. So instead of it just being these 20 polyphonic voices going in and out of each other, somehow very nimbly, it doesn't ever really feel like they're two on top of each other. But those 20 voices tell the story of these people who are treating this with various sort of, you know, in various different ways. Some of them are fascinated by what they might find there. Some of them are terrified by the journey. Some of them are missing home, and particularly because many of them are from the Isle of Man, there's also a cultural aspect of them being different noticeably to the English people on board. And so therefore there's a kind of thing set up as well automatically about power dynamics, that even though they are traveling all together and they're one ship, there are these dynamics that they can't quite leave at home. So there's all of this going on. But I think having that alongside the voice of the Aboriginal Tasmanian person, and particularly in a different time period, creates this as an almost historical document of looking back at these 20 people were saying all these things, and actually this is what we know the real impacts are of such things. And so this book just becomes this really fascinating discussion between two different sets of people in history and two different, well, slightly different time periods. And so it shouldn't work. But there is a way that this book then threads that back together at the end of taking these two sort of sets of voices and bringing them together. That is just utterly fascinating. It's a really weird book in some ways, but also a lot more accessible than any of that suggests. And I think it's just an incredibly bold and ambitious piece of writing to look at that, and particularly to look right in the face of the traditional historical fiction narratives of, you know, we're all going on this big exciting voyage and it maybe is a bit scary and a bit dangerous, to treat that with some sense of remove, of having somebody looking back and saying, well, they said that they were really happy and excited and all of these sorts of things, and they're looking for the Garden of Eden, but this is the impact they had on us. This is how our population was decimated. And so it has a bitter note to it that is really fascinating and really vital, I think, in this book as well. And last but not least, we have The Deposition of Father McGreevy, and this is by Brian O'Doherty. And this was a really, again, in terms of this sense of stories and who can tell stories, I think was an interesting book as well. So we start the book with a prologue that basically says, you're about to hear a story from Father McGreevy. Do we know how much we can trust what he's about to say? And that the deposition of Father McGreevy himself is sort of probably like 95% of this book. The vast majority of the pages of this book are the McGreevy bit, and then there's this prologue at the beginning, there's an epilogue, and there are a couple of other characters who are given the chance to sort of speak, or we see things a bit more through their lens at the end. So what then follows is the deposition of Father McGreevy is both treated as the central text of the truthful part, or the bit that we would read as the novel, but we're also taught by what surrounds it to treat it with some degree of skepticism. And that includes, there are footnotes throughout the book as well. And the footnotes mostly don't contradict Father McGreevy, but they do add context that make it clear that Father McGreevy is not just speaking directly to us. This is a deposition. This is something he has had to say because of a set of things that went on. And we soon learn what that was that happened. So essentially there is a village in Ireland, and there are strange goings on where at one point all of the women of a certain age, and particularly of child rearing age, become incredibly sick and die almost immediately. That's a very quick turnaround. Nobody can quite work out what the illness is. It's incredibly sort of horrific, and they seem to become very, very ill very quickly, and the men don't in quite the same way. The men maybe get slight colds or whatever, but they don't die, or at least not anywhere near the same rate as the women. And so in trying to work out what's happening, we learn from Father McGreevy. We learn everything that he is going to tell us about what he did, how he tried to be the person both working out what was happening, but also to do his role as a father in this society, and to be there for the deaths, to acknowledge them, to help them with the rites of passage for what comes next. And this, I thought, was the really interesting nub of what was going on in this book, because we are obviously hearing his perspective, and we are seeing that through the lens of a father and a sort of religious figure. But we also know that there are lots of things going on that feel slightly more suspicious. There are various characters who are brought in who seem to have some sense of history connected to everything that's been going on. But we don't necessarily get a resolution for much of the book. And this is why these final chapters that tell things through these different perspectives are so interesting, because these are characters who, for early parts of the book, we maybe don't pay that much attention to. But as the book starts to come towards its end, we start to see them appearing, and we start to see how they maybe hold the key to some part of the story. And without giving anything away, there's one character who we meet at the end of the book who has been essentially sent to some kind of mental asylum for the time, and particularly is seen as being unwell and not able to differentiate the truth from lies. But actually at the same time, we as the reader are primed to look for truth hidden in plain sight, or lies hidden as truths. And so we start to think that maybe she is telling the truth and has just been painted or labelled as quote unquote crazy, because it was an inconvenient truth. And so this throws the whole book into disarray right at the very end. And I think it's a really fascinating way that this book is told. It's very readable, but yet there's something hidden underneath the surface that just feels uneasy. And yeah, I thought this was really clever. And again, a book I'd not heard of at all. But yes, it does something so interesting, and I was really impressed by what it's able to just sort of dust around the top of what you're reading and let you simmer with it to see if you can read some of the clues underneath what's going on. So those are the 6 books from the shortlist, these plus the 2 that I don't physically have. And I thought this was fascinating as a shortlist. Again, a shortlist that for the most part, I had not heard of most of these authors, even less so some of these books. And yet we've got this shortlist that is so cohesive on core themes. Almost all 6 books deal with the idea of who gets to tell a story, and particularly how much can we trust some of those stories when they come. The ways that, for example, in The Blind Assassin, we are taught to both trust and not trust the narrator in various ways are so interesting with in comparison to the Deposition of Father McGreevy, which really looks at this idea of what is a story anyway, who is allowed to be the authoritative voice of a story, and then particularly that in collaboration with things like these two books. So The Hiding Place, really looking at what stories you're not told when you are a child and how you maybe come to find those out later, what it means to be the teller of stories in The Keepers of Truth, as a journalist who has that power. What does it look like for something like The English Passengers, where we have a story contradicted or put in juxtaposed with a story from the people affected by it, who are often left out of those stories as well. And then something like When We Were Orphans, where the idea of a central story that holds together your life is something that you are in search of. And so it's rare to really see this much cohesion in a shortlist, I think, in terms of a theme. But it's so fascinating the ways that these 6 books interrogate this idea of storytelling, which again is a common thing for novels because they are stories, but there's something so specific about the way these books play with that I think is so fun, and so interesting, and I really, really greatly enjoyed this shortlist. If I were to pick my winners from this, I do think The Blind Assassin is a very, very worthy winner in this list. I think they did get it right with this. And again, it's really difficult because I really want to go into how this book subverts all of your expectations towards the end. And I remember the first time I read this, having a real sort of floor dropping away from you moment, because it's such a shock the way that this book integrates something quite pivotal here that I think is really interesting then on a reread, because going into the book knowing it still makes you question this. And I think that's probably, I'd imagine, what tipped this book over the edge to be a very worthy winner, I think. I also think, personally, When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro could easily have been his second win. I think this is a phenomenal piece of storytelling. It's so subtle and beautiful, and I think deals with the changing of worlds and governments and politics and things all around the world in this really beautiful and just tender way at times, in that way that he has. And I think, yeah, like I said earlier, I think this is just some of his most interesting character work, of really delving into the heads of various characters here. But I think it's also just an exciting shortlist for just books that really throw spanners in the works in other ways. So English Passengers, I was really impressed by, for just how it takes what could be a really standard historical fiction trope and subverts it in really clever and vital ways. And the same for The Deposition of Father McGreevy, which I think just plays with this sense of readers and our sense of trust, that we normally go into books expecting that we can trust the narrators, and we are forced to realise that maybe that's not the case here as well, and we become the sort of detectives in the book as well. So that's a way of me basically saying many of these books could have won, and I think, you know, would, if there were an all-stars of books for the Booker, this would have been it. This would have had a lot of these in it, I think. But these are fantastic books, and I really do urge you to pick them up if you think they sound of interest to you. And particularly, you know, some of the authors here I'm keen to read a bit more of as well. It's just made me realise as well how much I love Margaret Atwood, and I need to go back and read even more of hers, because when she's in good form like this, she's just unstoppable, I think. Yeah, anyway, I hope you're doing really well. Thank you for following along with my Booker project, as is. We're getting closer and closer to the end, but I am still really loving discovering new books that otherwise I probably would never have touched or heard of before. So yeah, that's been really fun, and I do urge you to pick them up if they sound of interest. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.